The week she died, it rained nonstop, as if the universe was weeping for Joan. She had led a simple life up to that point, waking at 7 every morning to eat egg whites and drink a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. While considering the chances she missed and the possibilities she had squandered, she had spent her life fantasizing instead of acting, and now in her late 30s the dream was dwindling and reality was a hot shower and a restless night of sleep. The morning routine was followed by the occasional cry and an internal motivational speech, in which she would tell herself to get her shit together. But her drive wasn't what it once was, as she had grown exhausted while being trampled by the trials of life. Work was an endless nightmare, a repetitious zombie-like fugue state, where she enslaved herself for the luxury of debt and bills. She would often sit at her desk and stare at her account balance, fantasizing of a random deposit of ones and zeros, flooding in from some unnamed source of generosity. Her co-workers would enter the office with over-the-top compliments and platitudes as if to lessen the weight of the load. They were about to pawn off on her. Every one of them had some engagement that somehow prevented them from taking care of their own responsibilities. And at the end of the day, it was almost a statistical guarantee that Joan would leave her job with a box full of her co-workers' tasks. Joan would get into her car and sit for a minimum of 10 minutes, once for an hour, but to be fair, that was the day that Gene down the hall hung himself in his office, a sight that Joan had no intention of stumbling upon. But Gene was her office neighbor and had bought Joan a present on her second day of work. It was a cactus with a pot that said "Dream and Never Let Go." You see, Joan had gone to a nice little antique store during her lunch break, the one she knew Gene frequented quite often. She spent 30 minutes trying to find the perfect gift for one of her only allies. She finally settled on an old hand-cranked radio. It was quite the purchase, in which she ended up spending more money than she could. But she left the store thoroughly pleased. As she drove back to work with what she considered to be the perfect gift, Joan noticed a genuine smile on her face through the rear view, an occurrence which happened so sparingly that she was unsure if she was even able to produce one anymore. She pulled into the poorly lit parking garage and parked as quickly as she could. She jumped out of her car and flung open her back door where the old radio sat. She admired her purchase one last time before lugging the antique to the elevator. Once the elevator doors had closed, she sat the cumbersome relic down and let out a little gasp. When the door opened, she grabbed the radio and began to struggle down the hallway towards Gene's office, trying wholeheartedly to maintain a solid grip on the expensive chunk of wood, gears and springs she had just purchased. Upon arrival at Gene's office, Joan noticed that his door was shut completely, which seemed rather strange, considering how inviting Gene was normally. Nevertheless, she tried to bump the radio against the door in lieu of knocking. When there was no answer, Joan assumed that Gene was out, and decided to leave his gift as a pleasant little surprise for when he returned. She set the radio down and turned the handle of Gene's office door. The smell hit her first, whiskey, sharp and sour, cut through with the metallic tang of urine. Gene's body hung from a pipe in the ceiling, his neck bent at a grotesque angle. His polished shoes swayed inches above the desk, the rope creaking like a rusted hinge. His face had bloated to a mottled purple, veins bulging like ink spilled under glass. Blood vessels had burst in his eyes, leaving them raw and crimson, his tongue swollen and bitten nearly through at the tip. An empty bottle of cheap bourbon sat beside a note smudged with fingerprints. The letter read, "Dear Joan, I hope you're not the one that finds me like this. I am truly sorry if you are. I never meant to put any of this on you. I really never meant for any of this. I lost a part of myself a long time ago when Eric died. He was the love of my life and I never recovered. Before he was deployed, he assured me that he was completely safe, that he wasn't going to be anywhere near the danger. 4 excruciating months later, 2 walking uniforms handed me some fucking letter of condolence. A real sincere apology from Uncle Sam and his murder machine. A fucking letter in exchange for the love of my life being obliterated in an exploding helicopter. Before that moment, I had been on track to be a software engineer living my dream. But after I lost all desire to move forward, I accepted a shit position in life and blamed myself for everything. I received the news 10 years ago today that I would never be able to spend another moment with purpose beyond the natural instinct of base survival. Today, while sitting at my desk, I realized that my life had already ended, that there was nothing left for me, so I made the decision to end a miserable existence in exchange for a minute chance of being with Eric again. P.S. Joan, I have one last request from you. Well, two. First, please feed my cat and find her a home. She is a great cat, and I have no one else to help me. The second thing is that you take control of your life and make a difference. Just do something, Joan. You're not too old or too broken yet. Please take a chance and don't end up like me. Joan kept the letter at work for months, reading it on occasion before eventually taking it home and laying it in a drawer where she pretended to forget it for a time. Joan couldn't help but think about Gene often. He was the only man she had ever met that had never tried to take a part of her with him. In fact, he had always given more to her than he had taken. In a way, she felt some kind of love for Gene. He reminded her of her father, well, except he was sober more often than her father. Not that Joan's father didn't try to be a passable paternal figure, but he had many demons to deal with. One of them being the horrid memories of his own father, who would often enter the room he and his sister shared and initiate what he called playtime, in which he would coerce them into undressing and doing unspeakable acts from the time he was 9 and his sister only 7. Of course, Joan's father would never admit this to anyone, including Joan. After all, his father was long gone, as well as his sister, who had been a patient at a psych ward for the better part of 20 years. Joan's father had buried the memory deep and had forced it further into the subconscious over the years, as each time that it surfaced in his thoughts, he would push it down further. He never even attempted to deal with the trauma that was forced onto him, and often displayed fits of rage due to his repression. But he never once laid a hand on his wife or daughter. But he was also rarely around, and the few times he was around, he was never sober. Joan was unlucky enough to visit her aunt one time in her life. At the age of 14, Joan's father drove her to the facility where his sister was being held. He gave her no warning and no reason. He just said that he needed to show her something. The first thing Joan noticed upon entering the almost prison-like structure was the whiteness of the walls, along with the smell of chemicals much like those found in your average hospital. A clear sign that another odor was being masked. The fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped flies. A nurse with chipped pink nail polish eyed Joan's trembling hands before buzzing them through a heavy door. Joan felt a surge of fear as people behind glass buzzed her and her dad through the facility. It felt as if they had been waiting for an eternity, but they finally arrived at the visitors area, which was really just a couple of tables with some chairs, all of which seemed to be attached to the floor. Joan and her father sat quietly for at least 45 minutes before Joan's aunt shuffled into the room, wearing a white medical gown with restraints bound to her hands and feet. She was accompanied by a tall man in solid white. Joan's aunt sat directly across from her, staring at her with a blank, expressionless face. Her wrists were raw where the leather straps had bitten into her skin, and patches of her scalp showed through clumps of torn-out hair. The only thing Joan's father said on the hour-long drive back to their home was that his sister had suffered horrible trauma and wasn't able to deal with it. Joan would never learn that her grandfather had institutionalized her aunt after she had threatened to expose him. He claimed his daughter had been doing hard drugs, which was true to a point. After all, she was dealing with a massive trauma that made a perfectly happy young girl into a completely broken shell. He also claimed that she had tried to harm herself in front of him. The facility, which loved using shock therapy and heavy doses of drugs, had effectively left Joan's aunt incapable of forming any rational thought, and with their help, her father had managed to destroy his daughter completely. After that day, Joan's father never spoke of his sister again. He would die a few years later from liver failure. Joan would arrive home after work and become stationary. Her house, while small, was quite comfortable and charming. Pleasant artwork covered the walls, and in a corner untouched sat the antique radio, which had become a twisted reminder of her friend's end. Joan would flip the television on with no intention of ever paying attention to whatever appeared on the screen. She would heat up some food, which was more often than not a frozen dinner. Then she would start her nightly routine, which ended with her lying in bed staring at the wall until 2 in the morning before finally drifting off to sleep. One morning, instead of following her usual routine of egg whites and orange juice, instead she went out and found a local diner for breakfast. While eating, she noticed a newspaper and began searching through the classifieds at the job listings. She had ordered the blueberry pancakes, which was a dish her mom had always made her when she was down. She sipped on coffee, even though she didn't tend to care for the bitterness. She had added half and half with 2 packets of sugar, another reference to her mother. Joan had always emulated her mom, a strong, thoughtful woman with a gift for understanding. Joan had often thought back to the mornings when her mom would make breakfast and tell Joan fantastical stories of growing up in a family of musicians and artists. Joan often wondered how her mother and father ever came together. They were completely different in almost every way. Joan's father was the son of a hardened construction worker, and her mom was a part of a creative and artistic family. Joan had always assumed it must have been an anomaly of some kind. By the end of her breakfast, Joan had come to a decision. She would put her 2 weeks' notice in at work and go back to school for something she felt strongly about. She was finally ready to take a real chance for once in her life. She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: determination. She proceeded to take the long, scenic way to work. Today, she had no fear of being late. She had no worries of being scrutinized. For once in her life, Joan felt at peace with herself and the prospects of her future. When Joan arrived at work, she was met with hostility from her manager, who had noticed her tardiness and had taken it upon himself to make Joan an example for the consequences of not being on time. Joan simply chose to ignore his aggression and instead focused on her plans for the future. She wasn't going to let her manager's fragile masculinity get in the way of her new revelation. Joan spent much of the day looking into different universities as well as financial aid for schools. She had gone to university after high school, but dropped out in order to take care of her mom after she was diagnosed with cancer. Sadly, her mom passed away a year later, but Joan had never gotten a real opportunity to go back to school. At the end of the workday, Joan sent her manager an email containing her 2 weeks' notice along with a nicely worded thank you note attached. But before she could even make it out to the parking garage, her phone started emitting the sounds of multiple notifications. Before she could even look at her phone to see the notifications, the phone started ringing. It was her manager. He had texted Joan multiple times asking her to come to his office and talk about things. She declined the call and put her phone on silent. The company she worked for was known for underpaying and treating employees poorly until they attempted to quit, and then begging them with scraps to stay. Joan didn't want to hear anything her manager had to say. She was done with that part of her life. Over the next 2 weeks, her manager didn't speak to her and instead had his assistant relay any and all messages back to Joan. This, of course, didn't bother Joan at all. She had never cared for her manager and was relieved that she didn't have to talk to him anymore. He was someone that Jean and Joan would mock over the way he treated people, especially the women in the office, who he would often make inappropriate advances towards. So Joan didn't mind not being objectified during her final 2 weeks. Joan spent much of her remaining work hours ignoring her responsibilities while searching for the school. After a week of searching, Joan had decided that she wanted to become a psychologist. Joan applied for a school and began to wait. During the wait, Joan started to participate in social activities that she had never attempted before, at least not in a serious manner. It was like her whole existence had changed with one decision. After a couple of weeks, she received a letter accepting her into school, and she was ecstatic. This was everything she had ever wanted without even realizing until that moment. Joan spent the next couple of weeks experiencing much of the life she had missed out on when she was younger due to her circumstances. She lived out her more youthful fantasies, which included somewhat reckless behavior at times, but it was always rather tame compared to stories Joan had heard growing up. One weekend, Joan met someone who made her feel really special while she was out at a bar. She ended up going home with them and had an unforgettable night of passion, which she assumed was a specialty event for both parties. But when she woke up the next morning, the other person ushered Joan out quickly with no real explanation. That really hurt Joan on a very deep level. She felt used and thrown out. It sent her into a depressed mental state and caused a lot of self-doubt. She didn't feel like going out anymore. Instead, she receded back into her old habits of mindless repetition. She rationalized it by telling herself that school was about to begin and that she needed to focus. But deep down, the pain was still very real. Once school began, things gradually became better. Joan put all of her focus into her classes and studies, which was great in the sense that it left her with no time to obsess over her other more personal issues. Joan became quite popular among a group of her classmates, mostly due to the fact that she always took great notes and made copies for her classmates to use. Joan told herself she didn't mind because at least she didn't feel alone in the study groups, even though in the back of her mind, she knew it was the same dynamic she had experienced with her coworkers at her last job. The day of her death was eerily normal. Joan made her classic breakfast of egg whites with a glass of orange juice. She decided to ride her bike to the library, something she had made a semi-regular thing over the last few months. As she got closer to the library, she could see her study group waiting outside. As she approached the crosswalk, she noticed a homeless woman and handed her some change from her pocket. By that time, the light had turned red, and so she waited. The homeless woman's fingernails brushed Joan's palm, cold, and cracked as she muttered, bless you, like a rosary." When the light turned green, she began to pedal across the street. The car came from her left, a silver sedan with a shattered headlight, radio blasting static. The driver's head lolled against the window, mouth slack. Tires screeched. Joan's lungs filled with the stench of burnt rubber, half a heartbeat before impact. The sedan struck her hip first. Her femur snapped with a wet crunch. The bike folded like foil as her body arced 20 feet, limbs flailing before slamming into the pavement. Her skull cracked against the curb, blood pooling thick and dark beneath her hair. Her study group sprinted toward her. One boy, Josh, who'd once lent her a pencil and lingered too close, screamed, "Call 911," but stood frozen, staring at her left leg twisted backward, denim torn and bone jutting through. Paramedics worked on her for 30 minutes. One pressed gauze to her skull, while another barked vitals, BP 60/40, pupils fixed. They loaded her into the ambulance, sirens wailing. Her hand slipped off the gurney, dangling limp as the doors slammed shut. She was pronounced dead on arrival. Rain still fell as they zipped the body bag. At her desk, the cactus Jean had given her sat untouched, its soil dry and cracked. The pot's message, "Dream and never let go," faded under a layer of dust.